Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Tonight, we're heading west to the sun-scorched streets, hidden canyons, and haunted coastlines of Southern California, where glamour masks grim truths, and the land itself remembers every secret, from cursed vineyards and eerie desert lights to whispers beneath the waves. These are 10 disturbing, true horror stories that stretch from the high desert to the ocean deep, each one more unsettling than the last. But before we begin, here's something strange. Most people make one chilling mistake. They watch, but they don't subscribe. And by doing that, they vanish into the dark without hearing the rest of the nightmare. Don't let that be you. Hit subscribe now and ring the bell because, trust me, what's coming next, ... you don't want to miss. Now tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Koozie, the night is only just beginning. The horror is waiting to unfold. Let's dive into the darkness. It had been years since Jamie Stratton had seen the inside of a recording studio. The last time was the kind of memory he buried with the others, the ones you can't dig up without choking on the stench of failure. He'd been a musician once, a name some people in the bars still whispered, but those days felt like they belonged to someone else. The records hadn't sold, the tours had crumbled, and in the end, all that was left were pills, whiskey, and a wallet that barely made the rent. But here he was, sitting in the cramped trailer on the edge of Bombay Beach, looking out over the toxic, oily waters of the Salton Sea. He wasn't running away from anything, he told himself. Not exactly. But when you've lost everything, there's a strange kind of comfort in the isolation of a place like this. The Salton Sea was once a vacation paradise, but now it was a desert ghost. The water fouled with decades of chemical rot, the air heavy with the stench of something decaying beneath the surface, just like him. He'd come here to try to write one last album, to reclaim some semblance of what he had lost. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was a slow march toward his own grave. But at least it was something. The trailer was nothing weathered, with more cracks than a man like him could count in a lifetime, but it was quiet. That was the thing he needed the most. The silence was suffocating, but it was honest. No distractions, no people. Just the hum of his broken thoughts and the eerie, endless stretch of salt flats. The first night, it was the wind that rattled him awake. The kind of wind that carried the sound of distant voices that should have been too far to hear. It was a woman, clear as a bell, singing a lullaby in the darkness. The voice slid through the cracks in the trailer walls, soft and steady, with a beauty that cut right through him. He thought he was dreaming. That was the only explanation. A fragment of some other life playing in his mind. But the next night, the same thing. The voice again, lingering in the air like the scent of roses, and yet something was wrong. The sound felt too close, too insistent, like it was coming from the water just beyond the beach. By the third night, the voice was no longer a comfort. It gnawed at him, tugged at his nerves. He tried to shake it off. He'd been here before, hadn't he? Well, the addiction, the constant cravings, the desperate need to drown out the noise in his head. But no matter how many pills he swallowed or how many beers he knocked back, the voice stayed with him, wrapping around his skull like a vice. The air tasted like dust and rot as he stepped out of the trailer, the soles of his boots crunching against the dry, cracked earth. The moon hung low over the Salton Sea, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The wind whispered like 1,000 voices, but the woman's song was still the loudest. It wasn't a lullaby anymore. It had shifted into something darker, something pleading. Jamie couldn't help himself. He found his feet moving, pulling him toward the water. Each step was heavy, weighted down with a fear he couldn't name. But there was something about the voice that called to him, like a siren luring a drowning man. He didn't know why, but he needed to follow it. He had to know where it was coming from. The closer he got, the stronger the voice became, twisting in the wind until it was no longer just a melody. It was a cry. A hunger. He reached the shoreline, standing at the edge of the rotting water, his stomach sour with dread. The silence between the notes was suffocating. He felt like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't see, something that had been waiting for him, and then he saw it, half buried in the sand. Near the water's edge was a shape, something out of place, something that didn't belong. It was a human figure, half covered in the shifting sands. The moonlight illuminated just enough of it to send a shiver crawling up his spine. The thing didn't look like a body. Not exactly. There was a head too large for a woman, twisted and malformed, but the eyes. God, the eyes were the worst. They weren't eyes at all, but something else, black and glistening like the depths of the sea itself, reflecting the stars as if they belonged to something ancient, something not meant to be understood. And the singing the song wasn't coming from her mouth. It was coming from the sand, from the earth itself. A voice that had been waiting there, buried for decades. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a song. It was a call, the kind of call that led men into madness. The kind of call that promised everything and delivered nothing. He backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. But it was already too late. The voice was everywhere, all around him. The earth seemed to pulse with it. A song of dreams long lost, of hope turned to dust, of the promise of something better, something just out of reach. It was the sound of everything he had wanted, everything he had chased, and everything he had destroyed. Jamie staggered back toward the trailer, but he could feel it following him. The hunger, the longing, the rod of forgotten dreams clawing at his soul. He slammed the door shut behind him, his breath ragged. He thought he had escaped it, thought he could outrun it, like he had everything else in his life. But the song never stopped. It never stopped. Not until it had what it wanted. Jamie Stratton was just another name lost to the rotting waters of the Salton Sea. It was nearly 2:30 in the morning when Jimmy Albright noticed the sign, hanging there in the pale glow of his headlights like a dead man's whisper. He'd been driving for hours, his eyes bloodshot from the constant drone of the road, the hum of the tires against the asphalt lulling him into a state of half-consciousness. The night was swallowing him whole. Every mile, every turn felt like a stitch in the thickening fabric of fatigue that was slowly choking him. The sign was small, almost hidden, just a faded green exit marker, number 68. He squinted, trying to focus on it, thinking it was just a trick of the tiredness. Exit 68. He didn't recall seeing it before. The map on his phone had shown nothing but an endless ribbon of highway between San Diego and Los Angeles. The GPS was silent, as though it had nothing to say about this exit, like it didn't exist. Curiosity pricked at him, as did the growing restlessness in his bones. He should have kept driving, should have powered through, but there was something about the sign that felt urgent. And then there was the way his body reacted, his hands tightening on the steering wheel, his foot slightly pressing on the gas as if the road itself was calling him. What the hell, he thought. It was a quiet night, the kind where you could hear your thoughts too clearly. He was already running late, already exhausted, so what was one more detour? The moment he took the off-ramp, the world outside the car seemed to change. The air felt heavier, thick with the smell of dust, and something darker, something rotten. The stretch of highway ahead of him was long and empty. A ribbon of cracked concrete that disappeared into the shadows, stretching farther than any road had a right to. And then the headlights flickered. He cursed under his breath and slapped the dashboard, willing the car's lights to stay steady. It wasn't the kind of place where your car was supposed to mess with you. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise, and for the first time in years, he wished he wasn't alone. His mind reeled for a reason to turn around, but something about the stretch of highway ahead about that goddamn exit 68 pulled him in. Like a trap he couldn't resist, there was no traffic, not a single car in sight. Just the open road, and then he saw them. At first, it was just shapes figures standing on the side of the road, watching him as he passed. The kind of people who had no business being there, dressed in strange, outdated clothes. Their eyes reflected the headlights back at him, hollow and empty. He didn't slow down, didn't dare to. But as the miles stretched on, the figures didn't go away. They followed him, shadows moving in his rearview mirror. Their faces distorted and twisted with something that made his gut churn. He could almost hear their whispers in the air, carried by the wind. You can't run from your regrets. Jimmy ... He turned the radio on, cranked it up. Anything to drown out the creeping unease that was spreading through his chest. But the static mixed with the song on the radio, turning it into an eerie hum, one that resonated with something deep inside him. It was like the very road was alive, breathing, wrapping its fingers around him, and then the lights flickered again, brighter this time. The car stalled for a second, and when it sputtered back to life, the road had changed. Gone were the familiar signs of life, the familiar blink of distance markers, or the hum of the nearby freeway. Instead, the road stretched into something unfamiliar. The pavement was cracked and uneven, weeds growing between the cracks, and the horizon was an empty black void. Then came the voice. It wasn't through the radio. It wasn't in the air. It came from the back seat. "Do you remember me, Jimmy?" His heart slammed against his ribs. He jerked the rearview mirror to catch a glimpse, but the back seat was empty, save for his bag and some old fast food wrappers. Still, the voice, soft, cold, and almost affectionate, was undeniable. He didn't have to think too hard about it to know whose voice it was. Sarah. He hadn't thought about her in years. She was a ghost he'd buried deep, far beneath the weight of the years, beneath the wreckage of everything that had come after. She was the one regret he could never shake, the one that aided him in quiet moments, in the places where his mind wandered without his permission. They were supposed to be a team, supposed to be two kids with a shared dream, but that dream had died the night the accident happened. It was his fault. He should have stopped. He could have swerved. He could have saved her. But instead, he'd kept driving. She'd been crying in the passenger seat, screaming at him to stop, and all he'd done was push the gas pedal harder, trying to outrun the rain, the night, the guilt, and now she was here. Sarah. His voice came out hoarse, but the words tasted wrong, like he hadn't said her name in too long. "You left me behind," she whispered again, the words curling like smoke in the back seat, drowning him. The air felt colder now, colder than the night had a right to be. The temperature inside the car dropped to a bone-chilling degree. His breath came out in clouds. He tried to speed up, but the car felt heavier, like it was being pulled backward by an unseen force. The figures had gathered on the side of the road, standing in perfect stillness, watching him with eyes that seemed to sink deeper into their skulls with each mile he drove. There were more of them now, dozens. A sign came up, a flash of fluorescent green, and before he even realized what it was, his hands were already jerking the wheel. Exit 68. Only this time, there was no sign to tell him to turn around. The exit was a mouth, gaping wide, a dark hole in the middle of the road, a place he couldn't leave without going through. "You've made a deal, Jimmy," Sarah's voice cooed, now all around him, as though she was inside his head. "You played the game, and you lost." His eyes darted around. The road didn't look like a road anymore. It was a trap, a maze of memories, all of them crawling into the back seat. With him, the ghosts were real now, real and hungry. And when he heard the crunch of the gravel beneath his tires, he knew he wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't leaving this road. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him whole was Sarah's voice, singing softly in his ear, "You'll never escape." Professor David Kincaid wasn't a man given to superstition. A historian by trade, he lived in the world of facts and dates, of dusty tomes and ancient documents. But standing in the center of the old mission San Juan Capistrano, with its crumbling adobe walls and the scent of age clinging to the air, he felt something he couldn't quite explain, something cold, something wrong. It had started as an innocent enough project. The mission was undergoing a restoration, and as part of the team, David had been tasked with uncovering and documenting anything of historical significance hidden beneath its weathered floors. He had expected to find forgotten artifacts, perhaps an old piece of pottery or a faded map from the 18th century. What he found, however, was something far darker, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The sealed room was hidden beneath the mission's altar. It was an accident, really, that they found it at all. The restoration crew had been digging to reinforce the foundation. And as the old floorboards cracked and groaned under the weight of their tools, the ground gave way in a section that had never been disturbed before. Beneath the altar, a small trapdoor was revealed, half buried in dust and debris. It had been locked tight for as long as anyone could remember. Hidden away from the prying eyes of history, David was the first to enter, and when he crawled down into the darkness below, he was immediately struck by the cold. The air was thick with something that made his chest tighten and his skin prickle, though he couldn't explain why. The light from his flashlight flickered over stone walls and uneven floors, revealing a room that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. But it was the bones that caught his attention first, the remains of native children. By the looks of them, were scattered across the floor in small, neat piles. Their skeletal forms were disturbingly intact, though their small bones had been bleached by time. The walls, too, were etched with strange symbols that David didn't recognize. They weren't from any language he knew, and that alone set his teeth on edge. But what chilled him the most was the journal. It lay in the corner, tucked under a pile of skeletal remains, as if it had been left there deliberately, as though someone had wanted it hidden from the world. The pages were yellowed, brittle, and the ink faded, but the writing, that was what made David's blood run cold. It was written in a language he could not even begin to understand, but the characters, the shapes of the letters, twisted in a way that was unnatural, as if they were alive, as if they were moving on the page, writhing just out of the corner of his vision. He picked it up, the weight of the journal heavy in his hands. The air around him seemed to shift, growing colder still, and an overwhelming sense of dread flooded his chest. It wasn't a rational fear. It was a primal, bone-deep terror, the kind of fear that made you believe in things you didn't want to. That night, as he lay in his bed at the small inn down the street from the mission, David tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in the back of his mind. The journal was locked away in his bag, tucked safely out of sight. But no matter how much he tried to force himself to sleep, his mind kept returning to that room, the skeletal remains, the strange language, the presence of something ancient and forgotten beneath the mission's holy ground. And then, in the dead of night, it began. The bells. At first, David thought it was just a figment of his imagination, the product of too many hours spent in the musty air of the mission. But the bells rang again the next night, and the night after that. Each time they rang louder, their tolls deep and mournful, as though they were being pulled from the earth itself, resonating in the hollow spaces beneath the mission. There were no bells on the mission's tower. The building was centuries old, and while it had once had bells, they had long since been removed. their metal stripped away for other purposes. Yet still, the bells rang, their sound echoing across the empty town, through the quiet streets and into David's very bones. And as the nights passed, something else began to change. David started to hear whispers. They were soft at first, just a faint scratching sound on the edge of his hearing, like a voice calling from a long distance. But as the bells rang louder, the whispers grew clearer, closer. They were coming from inside his own head. Find me. Find my voice. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't focus. The journal he had found, the one written in that twisted, unknowable language, was now a weight on his conscience. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop thinking about the children buried beneath a mission. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their tiny bones, their empty skulls staring up at him, accusing him. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was a presence. Something ancient, something tied to the land and to the mission itself. It was watching him, waiting. On the fourth night, David couldn't take it anymore. He returned to the mission, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. The bells were ringing, louder now, as though they were calling him, beckoning him down into the crypt beneath the altar. He descended into the darkness once more, the air thick with that same oppressive weight. The room seemed different now. The symbols on the walls had grown more distinct, the lines sharper, as if they were being drawn in real time. And the bones there were more of them now. More children, more remains. As he stepped closer, his heart hammered in his chest. The journal was open now, as though someone or something had turned its pages. David could feel the language pulling at his mind, warping his thoughts, pushing him toward something. Toward the center of the room. There on the floor was a single symbol that wasn't there before. It was new wedged into the stone, freshly. Carved, it resembled a face, or perhaps a skull, with an open mouth, and beneath it, the words, "No, not words." A plea. An invitation. Speak my name. David reached out, unable to stop himself, his fingers brushing against the stone. The moment he touched it, the bells stopped ringing. The air went still, and then the whisper returned, louder now, almost deafening. You have awakened me. He turned to run, but it was too late. The ground beneath the mission trembled, and the bones of the children, those poor, forgotten souls, rose from the earth, their hollow eyes staring up at him. The journal was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. But the voices of those long buried, were everywhere now, filling his ears, filling his soul with the knowledge that some histories could never be erased. Some debts could never be paid. The mission had its voice back, and David Kincaid would never leave. When Craig Lawrence packed up his old Jeep and drove out into the Mojave Desert, he wasn't chasing anything specific. That's the truth of it. He wasn't expecting the creepy pirate radio signal that had started humming through his battered podcast speakers, the one that played nothing but old nursery rhymes and confessions, horrifying, haunting confessions about murder. He didn't believe in coincidences. Craig was a conspiracy podcaster by trade, a burnt-out man who had once seen the world through the lens of hidden truths and governmental cover-ups. But the passion for it had long since gone, replaced by a hollow ache in his gut every time he hit record. He'd spent months, maybe even years, talking about the same stuff: the deep state, the globalists, all those things that, in truth, made him numb. In fact, he couldn't even remember the last time he'd done an episode. That didn't feel like a chore, but this was different. This had legs. The signal was static at first, just a low hum in the desert night. But when he tuned it in properly, he heard the soft, cracking voice of a man, old and trembling, confessing in quiet tones. It was the kind of confession that didn't ask for forgiveness, it demanded it. "I didn't mean it," the voice said, trembling, its words clipped and ragged. I thought she was just a girl. But then the voice cut off, replaced by the shrill strains of an old nursery rhyme, one that made his skin crawl. The mice, the mice. The little gray mice, they'll come for you at the stroke of midnight. He knew right then, this was something big, something important, something that had to be real. Craig wasn't naive. He'd heard the whisperings about the old radio tower outside Lancaster Ann abandoned, relic of a time when things like free speech were considered dangerous. But this felt wrong, and for the first time in ages, it felt like something that mattered. The signal was weak at first, barely a whisper over the endless static, but Craig was hooked. He could feel the pull. Its obsession flared back to life as the voice continued, its words growing more frantic. A deep-seated need to understand what had happened to the person speaking, to uncover the truth behind the confessions, and more importantly, the nursery rhymes. There was something about those childish tunes, something sinister in their innocence. The voices on the other end of the static were getting to him, worming their way into his head. It didn't take long before Craig threw together a plan. He would find the source, find the tower, find the people responsible, and somehow put it all together. He needed the story, not just any story, a story that would put his name back on the map. A story that could resurrect his fading career. His Jeep hummed down the road toward the empty stretch of desert that led to the old tower. The sun had set long ago, leaving nothing but a sickly moon to guide him. The Mojave was eerily quiet, save for the wind whispering through the cacti and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. But the further he drove, the more he could feel something wrong about the place, something that scratched at the edges of his mind. The tower came in two, view like a skeletal sentinel against the night sky. Rusted and broken, it stood at the edge of the desert, a monument to forgotten broadcasts and lost souls. There were no signs, no markings to indicate its purpose or history. Just the twisted frame of an old radio tower rising from the sand. Craig parked his Jeep some distance away, his headlights casting long shadows on the cracked earth. As he approached the tower on foot, a strange shiver ran down his spine, like someone had just walked over his grave. The tower groaned in the wind, its rusted metal creaking as though it were alive waiting. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the stench of mildew. Craig's flashlight flickered as he stepped through the twisted frame of the entrance, his boots crunching on the dry sand that had blown in through the broken windows. There was nothing in the room at first, no equipment, no signs of life, just the broken remains of an old generator in the corner. But as he ventured further into the heart of the room, the floor creaked beneath his feet, and the radio signal, that damn signal, crackled through his headphones. It was louder now, clearer, and tinged with a faint, eerie quality that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The mice, the little gray mice, they'll come for you at the stroke of midnight. The rhyme again, and this time, the confession. It was clearer, more direct. I didn't mean it. The voice hissed, the words trembling with an intensity that Craig could almost feel. I thought it would be simple, but they were wrong. We were wrong. We made a mistake. Craig's pulse quickened as he swept the flashlight over the walls, and that's when he saw it. The remnants of the old cult. The walls were covered in blackened scribbles, frenzied and desperate symbols, sigils, notes in a language that almost seemed to bleed off the page. The more Craig stared at them, the more he felt like they were staring back. His mind felt unhinged, like it was unspooling just by being here. But it was the final confession, the last one, that froze him in place. I didn't think she'd come back, but she did. And now she's calling us, ... Calling me, and I can hear her whispering in the static. She's awake, Craig. She's awake. And then, the unmistakable sound of a woman crying. A sob that racked the air, heavy with sorrow and rage. That's when it hit him, the final sermon. The one broadcast in 1979, the one that had ended the lives of several members of a doomsday cult. They had believed in the voices of the dead, in the resurrection of lost souls through radio waves. But something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. The voices, the nursery rhymes, weren't from children, they were from the dead. From those who had died in this very place. A static crackle filled the room, loud and nauseating. Craig's vision blurred as he turned, heading for the exit. But the sound followed him. The confessions, the whispers, the sobbing. They all filled his head, drowning him in their urgency. Turn it off, please. Just turn it off. Craig stumbled. His feet tangled in the loose wires and broken equipment, the walls closing in around him. The air was thick with decay, with old voices calling to him, begging him to stay. The signal was alive, just like them. It had never stopped. He reached the door and shoved it open, gasping for breath, desperate to escape the weight of the past. The Mojave stretched out before him. The night air harsh and dry against his skin. But as he turned back to look at the tower, he saw it's she standing in the doorway, her face twisted in agony, her eyes hollow and black. The dead cult leader. Her figure bathed in the soft, sickly glow of the tower's lights. She was waiting for him to understand. The signal had never gone off the air. It was still playing. And now it was waiting for a new confession. Craig wasn't sure when he realized. He wouldn't leave the Mojave. It was just something he understood, a part of the madness that had sunk into his bones. The last thing he heard before the static swallowed him whole was the sound of a child's voice, singing the nursery rhyme. The mice, the little gray mice, ... And then there was nothing but the silence of the desert night. Nina never should have gone to the dry lake bed. She'd been obsessed with desert legends for as long as Noah could remember. Those tales that seemed to crawl out of the cracked earth like ghosts, half forgotten and half believed. Stories of ancient creatures, things with names that no one could pronounce, roaming the flat expanses of the Mojave. They were always just legends to Noah, something to amuse the curious. An idle pastime for a girl who spent too much time staring at stars and dreaming of mysteries beyond the horizon. But Nina had a different way of thinking, a different way of believing. It was always in her eyes, those big, dark eyes that saw patterns in the wind and the dirt, where others saw only emptiness. It was on one of those summer nights, just after the sun had set and the heat still clung to the air like a damp cloak, when she packed her bag with nothing more than a flashlight, a notebook, and her camera. The dry lake bed of El Mirage was close enough to the town to make Noah feel like he could reach her if he needed to, but far enough out that it felt like a different world altogether. Nina said she'd be back by dawn, that she'd make a trip to photograph the shifting sands and the odd formations that seemed to rise from the earth like forgotten gods. She said it would be her last camping trip before she went off to college in the fall. A farewell to the desert and to the stories it whispered. "Promise me you won't go out there alone," Noah had said, his voice thick with a concern he couldn't explain. She just laughed. "It's just a lake bed, Noah. There's nothing out there but dust and bones." The problem was that Nina believed in the bones, in the fossils that turned up occasionally in the shifting sand, those old remnants of creatures long gone, as though the desert had once been alive in a way they could never understand. She believed there was something more, something beneath the cracked earth. "I'll be fine," she'd said, her words a soft breeze, barely a whisper against the oppressive silence that always seemed to settle over the Mojave at night. That was the last time he saw her. When Noah woke the next morning, the sun already blistering the sky, Nina was gone. Her camping gear was left behind. Her notebook, the one she filled with sketches of strange symbols and ancient drawings, lay half buried in the dirt near the dried lake's edge. There was no sign of her camera, no footprints in the dirt, only the vast emptiness stretching for miles, mocking the very idea that someone could disappear so easily. Noah wasn't sure when the panic first crept in. Maybe it was when he realized there was no way she'd been swept away by the wind. Nina wouldn't leave the camp without saying something. Or maybe it was when he noticed the cracked earth of the dry lake bed, like the land itself had shifted overnight, making it harder to even know where she'd been. The vastness of it seemed to swallow her up, like it always had a way of swallowing things. He went searching. He walked the edge of the lake bed, calling her name into the endless stretch of desert, but there was no answer, no sign. His heart grew heavier with each step. His feet kicked up dust that swirled around his legs, leaving behind only the trace of his passing. Hours went by. Noah was on his knees in the dry lake bed when he saw it, a massive, gnarled shape, half buried beneath the cracked earth. It was like a fossilized creature, its bones large and distorted, twisted into unnatural forms that made Noah's gut churn. He hadn't expected to find something so ancient, so wrong. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. It was a creature unlike any Noah had ever seen. Not in books, not in the documentaries Nina used to watch obsessively. The shape was fluid, shapeless, but there was something about it that suggested a being that had once moved. The bones were hollow in places with strange symbols etched into them, markings that didn't belong to any language he knew. It was almost like the thing had been waiting there, trapped beneath the earth for eons, waiting for someone to find it. His hand brushed the dirt away from one of the bones, and that's when he heard it. A voice, a whisper, soft at first, like the wind rustling through dry leaves. But then it became clearer, louder, more insistent. Noah. He froze. The voice was Nina's. His heart skipped a beat. His breath hitched. He spun around, but the landscape remained the same, empty. Just the cracked earth and the dying remnants of a desert that didn't care about human lives. Noah? The voice was closer now. Oh, almost as though it were coming from the ground beneath him. The whisper was followed by the sound of something moving. Something slithering beneath the earth, scraping against the stone and bones buried below. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of dust and decay, and the very earth seemed to shift under his feet. Please, Noah, ... The voice was more desperate. Now, strained with something that didn't belong in Nina's voice. Something alien. Something wrong. He stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his chest. His eyes darted frantically across the barren landscape, but there was nothing. Nothing but the shifting shadows and the wind. Something was here with him.
Nina?
He called out, but the voice had already faded, swallowed by the desert, replaced by the endless hum of nothing. He dropped to his knees, his mind racing. What was this thing? What had it done to her? The whisper returned, this time from all directions, as though it were coming from beneath him, inside him, from everywhere. Nina's gone, Noah. She's with us now. With the bones, ... The voice's sisters drowned in the static of something. Ancient, something older than time itself. The thing beneath the earth had taken her. His hands trembled as he grabbed the flashlight and scanned the ground again. He had to get out. He had to leave before whatever this thing was could pull him in too. But when his light passed over the bones again, they weren't just fossils anymore. They were moving, twisting, growing, stretching outward like they were alive, like they had never truly died. And beneath the dry, cracked earth, he could hear the sound of Nina's voice one last time, distant, as though she were calling to him from the farthest reaches of the void. The sound grew louder, not with urgency, but with an unnatural calm. Come find me, Noah. But Noah didn't look back. He ran. He ran as fast as he could, the wind at his back, the sun in his eyes, the ground beneath him cracking with the weight of what was buried beneath. He didn't stop until he hit the edge of the desert, where the earth broke apart in jagged, unforgiving lines. He didn't stop until he heard the voice, Nina's voice, no longer calling, no longer whispering, just gone. And in that stillness, Noah knew that whatever was buried in that dry lake bed, it wasn't finished. It had never been finished. Was waiting for the next person to listen, waiting for the next voice to whisper in the desert wind. Frank Ellis had seen too much. His eyes were tired, his soul more so. The kinds of things he'd witnessed as a detective, horrors buried under the weight of time. Crime stitched into the fabric of forgotten lives had driven him to this desert, Palm Springs, somewhere with no history, no lingering ghosts. Or so he hoped. He had retired 2 years ago after decades of hunting down killers, child predators, and thieves who wore the same faces as the innocent. His last case, the one that had made him pack up his office and his badge for good, had never truly been solved. It was a case of murder. Sure, but more than that, it was about deceit. The kind of lie that weaves itself into the very heart of court scores. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that glides on smoothly. And we have a coarsely elastic / long-lasting color. It was a long-last hill. It was a case of martyr. Steve Loss. Mael / Elias. Mael / Wallasick. My wide. We wills. 8. My / // I have. With so mat guide, like so a quid. Unwa the rezasak it. I re-why like I. We su we so pep we lea we su it we sa to lie sit to sick get to get I to get to the ticket kit to sit at the god. It a foot that be sip it is interpreted that it's like sip but it's everything you believe, a lie that made you question your own reflection. So here he was, a man on the run from his past, hoping the dry heat of the desert would burn away the bad memories. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush. Watching over the quiet streets, Palm Springs was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted peace. They came for the sunshine, for the golf courses, for the spas, for the endless blue skies. But what Frank saw when he looked out over the palm trees, the horizon stretching far and wide, was emptiness. At night, when the temperature dropped and the stars came out, he took long walks along the cracked paths, the dry sand crunching under his boots. He'd pass the same set of century-old palm trees every night, their gnarled trunks twisting towards the heavens, their leaves shuffling in the wind like whispers. The shadows they cast were long, stretching out like arms trying to reach something, far beyond the grasp of earthly hands. But one night, Frank saw something he hadn't seen before. It was a shadow. Not the kind of shadow that danced lazily in the moonlight or rested comfortably at the edge of his vision. No, this one was different. It was a dark shape, darker than the night itself, moving beneath the palms as if it had a life of its own. And it was moving toward him. For a moment, Frank stood still, caught in the eerie stillness of it all. He told himself it was nothing, just a trick of the desert light. But something in him, a flicker of unease, surged him to move closer as he approached the shadow. It didn't dissipate like he expected. It grew, stretching and shifting, pulling itself around the base of a palm tree, a shape he couldn't quite make out. Frank stepped closer, his breath shallow. Then the shadow twisted. It was as though it was reaching for him, searching for something. "Get a grip," Frank muttered under his breath. His voice seemed swallowed by the vast emptiness of the desert. But the shadow didn't listen. It stayed, unmoving, just there, frozen in time. The next night, it was there again. And the night after that, the same strange shadow, in the same spot, at the same time. Every evening, like clockwork. And though Frank tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, his mind playing tricks on him, a part of him knew it wasn't. It was something real. There was a part of Palm Springs history that Frank hadn't yet uncovered. It wasn't the glamorous kind the kind tourists came to see. No, this history was hidden, buried beneath the smooth desert sands, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. As the days passed, Frank dug. He went to the library, talked to the locals, asked about the woman Lena Harrington, a name that had cropped up more than once in the old papers. Lena had been a local artist, a woman who had lived on the outskirts of town decades ago. Her body had been found beneath the very palms where Frank had seen the shadow. Her death ruled an accident. But there were whispers of something more. Some said she was killed by a jealous lover. Others said she'd fallen prey to the desert itself. But Frank found an old diary buried beneath layers of dust, the ink faded and barely legible. The final entry was all it took. I feel him coming for me tonight. The shadow, it's here. It watches me. He'll come for me, and I will have nowhere to hide. Frank's pulse quickened. It wasn't just Lena's death that had left a mark. On the town it was what happened after. Frank felt it in his bones now. Something that had lingered long after Lena had disappeared. And now it was reaching for him. It was a piece of his past, a case from years ago, one he had left unresolved, left buried in the cold corners of his mind. Lena had been connected to him in ways he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. She had been a part of the very case he had left behind. A victim of a crime so twisted, so buried in deceit that the truth had never come to light. The shadow wasn't just a ghost. It was a manifestation of his guilt, a thing forged in the furnace of his mistakes. Every night it grew stronger, more insistent, as if pulling him into its depths. And Frank realized, with a sinking sense of dread, that he couldn't outrun it anymore. The shadow wasn't just tied to the land or the past, it was tied to him. To his decisions, to the lies he'd told to keep himself safe, to the darkness he'd carried in his heart for so long he couldn't escape it. And now it was coming for him. Emily stood at the edge of the charred hill, her eyes tracing the smoldering remnants of what had once been a lush, vibrant landscape. Now, the Malibu hills were a skeleton of blackened trees, broken earth, and the lingering stench of death. The fire had come without warning. The winds had whipped it into a frenzy. And in just a few short hours, the world she knew had been consumed. Her husband, Jack, the man who had been her everything, was one of the casualties. The fire had taken him, and with him, the last piece of her heart. The house was still standing. It shouldn't have been. The flames had clawed at its edges, licking the windows, tearing at the wooden beams. But somehow, it had survived. The firefighters had been certain it wouldn't make it through the night. But when the smoke cleared and the dust settled, Emily had found herself standing in the threshold of the place where she had once felt safe. The place where she had once been whole. At first, she thought she would leave. But the thought of abandoning the house, the only thing that still tied her to Jack, was unbearable. So, she stayed. She thought she could heal here, away from the grief, away from the nightmare of losing him. She thought she could rebuild herself. But the house had other plans. The scent of ashes was the first thing that hit her when she stepped inside the house that first night after the fire. At first, she thought it was just a lingering effect, the last remnants of the disaster that had taken everything from her. She opened the windows, let the cool Malibu air sweep through the rooms, but the smell didn't fade. Instead, it seemed to grow more potent, like a presence filling every corner of the house. Choking the air, she tried to ignore it. She tried to tell herself it was just the lingering remnants of the fire, that the smoke had permeated the very walls, but every night it became more intense. The scent of burned wood and ash would fill the rooms, suffocating her as she tried to sleep. And then came the whispers. At first, they were faint. She thought it was the wind, maybe a creak in the house, but as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, soft murmur, like a voice just on the edge of hearing. And though the words were unintelligible, they carried a weight of promise that something was waiting. Emily woke one night to find shadows flickering at the edges of her vision, thin, twisting shapes that darted across the room as if trying to avoid her gaze. She stood up, heart pounding, and reached for the lamp on her nightstand. When the light flickered on, the shadows vanished, leaving only the empty, oppressive stillness of the room. But the smell, no matter what she did, remained. The ashes were everywhere. It wasn't just the house. It was her. It was in her skin, in her clothes, in the very fibers of her being. The ashes followed her no matter where she went. No matter how much she scrubbed the walls, how much incense she burned, or how many candles she lit, the scent always returned. And then, one evening, she found something that changed everything. She had been going through the old family photo albums, searching for a piece of Jack she could hold on to. In the back of one dusty album, she found a strange photograph. It was an old black and white image, dated 1925. The house looked the same, but it was different somehow. The shadows in the picture were darker, and in the background, a group of people stood around a large bonfire, their faces obscured in the haze of smoke. They wore strange robes, and something about their posture seemed ... wrong. She turned the photo over. The handwriting on the back was faded, but still legible. The fire will cleanse. The ashes will return us to the earth. A chill ran down Emily's spine. She hadn't known it, but the house had a history. A history she wasn't prepared for. The house had once belonged to a culta, group of people who had believed in the power of fire, of ritual purification, of returning to the earth through destruction. In the 1920s, the cult had conducted ceremonies in the house, burning everything in their path to cleanse the soul. Emily had read about the strange disappearances, the unexplained deaths in the area. But it had never occurred to her that they were connected to this place. The fire that had ravaged Malibu, the fire that had taken Jack, was not just a disaster, was a ritual long forgotten, yet still alive, deep within the bones of the house. The ashes, she realized, were not just the remains of a natural disaster. They were the remnants of something far darker, something that had been waiting for someone to come back. The whispers in the house grew louder, more insistent. At night, Emily could feel them, pressing in from all sides. She would wake to the smell of smoke, but the air would be cold, the fire long extinguished. The shadows would stretch across the walls and in the corner of the room. She would see the figure of a woman standing motionless, watching her. Emily tried to leave. She packed her things, ready to escape the nightmare that had consumed her. But when she reached the front door, it wouldn't open. The lock had rusted shut, the hinges too stiff to move. The house, it seemed, had claimed her. She was trapped, and then came the fire again. It wasn't a natural fire this time. No, this fire came from within, burning in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very air. It was an inferno that seemed to grow from the ashes, devouring everything in its path. But Emily wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had been marked. The fire wasn't meant to destroy her, it was meant to claim her, to return her to the earth with the others who had been sacrificed. The house, the ashes, the scent of smoke, it was all a part of the ritual. And now, she was the final piece. The ashes would take her, just as they had taken Jack, As the flames rose higher, Emily knew one thing for sure. She would never escape this place. The ashes would consume her soul, and when the fire burned out, there would be nothing left. Rachel Hernandez prided herself on being a skeptic. She had spent the last decade of her life writing articles and books debunking the most outlandish urban legends, peeling back the layers of folklore that people clung to in the dead of night. Ghosts, just a trick of light and shadow. Vampires, a mix of paranoia and pop culture. Demons, psychological projections of our deepest fears. She had built a career on dispelling the myths that fuel people's worst nightmares. So, when the story of the Hollow Moon of East LA reached her ears, she was almost disappointed. It had all the trappings of a perfect urban legend. Mysterious disappearances, a shadowy figure, and the kind of eerie atmosphere she'd grown so used to debunking. It was a story she should have dismissed without a second thought, but something about it gnawed at her. Maybe it was the fact that the legend centered on a lunar eclipse, a rare event that happened every decade, or the idea that this hollow man was tied to the darkest corners of East LA, a place she had only heard rumors about. It was enough to pique her curiosity. Rachel moved to East LA just as the next eclipse was approaching. She rented a small apartment in a nondescript building, one of those places where the smell of old cigarette smoke seemed to seep from the walls, and the floorboards creaked like whispers at midnight. It was the kind of place that invited strangers, kept secrets, and hid its stories beneath layers of cracked plaster and rusted pipes. The legend she was chasing claimed that every 10 years, during the eclipse, a creature emerged from the shadows. Descriptions of the creature varied. Some said it was humanoid. Others said it was something worse. But all of them agreed on one thing. The creature had a hollow face, empty except for eyes that reflected only the light of the moon. Hollow man, they called it. A predator who stalked the streets, stealing people away under the cover of the moon's shadow. Rachel had heard rumors of people vanishing during the eclipse, but no one had ever confirmed the stories. They were always whispers, rumors, unsubstantiated. Local legends were the bread and butter of her work, but this one felt different. There was a collective fear in East LA that was hard to ignore. People didn't speak of it openly, but they would look over their shoulders, nervous smiles twisting into something darker. When the eclipse was mentioned, Rachel was determined to crack this. She spent her days in local libraries, old records, and obscure websites, digging for any shred of evidence that could disprove the myth. But the deeper she dug, the more the pieces began to shift. People started disappearing, just as the legend said they would. It wasn't widespread, but it was enough to make her stop and think. One afternoon, Rachel met a local named Carlos, a middle-aged man who worked in a barber shop just down the street. His face was lined with the weight of too many sleepless nights, eyes sunken but sharp. He was the first person who had openly acknowledged the legend. "Do you believe in the Hollow Man?" she asked. Trying to gauge his reaction, Carlos hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I didn't, at first. Thought it was all crazy talk. Until I saw something." Rachel's pulse quickened. She leaned forward. "What did you see?" His hands shook slightly as he set the razor down. "It was last year, during the eclipse. I was walking home from the bar, just around the corner. From here, it was late, quiet. That's when I saw it. The figure. The Hollow Man. I thought it was a trick of the light, you know, a tease face. It was empty, like there was nothing behind the eyes. Just darkness. And when he looked at me, I swear the whole street froze." Rachel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the heat of the afternoon. "What happened?" Carlo's voice dropped, almost a whisper. "He walked toward me. Slow. I couldn't move. My legs, my feet, ... They wouldn't obey me. Then the streetlights flickered, and when I looked back, he was gone. She pressed him further, but Carlos had already clammed up, his eyes darting nervously to the door, as though he expected someone or something to come for him. Rachel's skepticism began to unravel. The more people she spoke to, the more the pattern emerged. The Hollow Man wasn't just a tale. It was a real fear that had taken root in the heart of the community, passed down from generation to generation. The lunar eclipse wasn't just a backdrop, it was an event that called something into being. As the days passed, Rachel's obsession grew. She couldn't help it. She wanted to prove it was a myth. She needed to be the one to unravel it, to show the world that there was a trace. There was a scientific explanation for the disappearances, the stories, the shadows. But as the night of the eclipse approached, something changed inside her. She began to feel as though she wasn't just researching a story. She was becoming part of it. The first night she felt it was 3 days before the eclipse. She had just finished her research and was about to head to bed when she saw something. Outside her apartment window, a figure standing under the flickering street lamp. Tall, too tall, and impossibly thin. The face of, you could even call it a face, was hollow, a void where features should have been. The eyes reflected only the pale light of the moon, and Rachel felt herself drawn to them, paralyzed. Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickened. She backed away from the window, but the figure didn't move, didn't have to. For the next few days, the city seemed to warp around her. People began avoiding her eyes, muttering to each other in low tones. She heard whispers everywhere. She's asking too many questions. She's digging too deep. The words blurred together. But Rachel couldn't escape them. The closer the eclipse came, the more the hallucinations increased. Faces in windows, figures in alleys, eyes reflecting only the moonlight, watching her every move. She began to question her own mind. Was she being hunted by something supernatural? Or was she just losing her grip on reality? Had she spent so long debunking myths that she'd become a part of one? Had the legend become her own? On the night of the eclipse, Rachel stood on the rooftop of her building, the moon high above, casting long shadows across the city. The figure appeared again, standing at the far end of the street. This time, it didn't just stand there. It moved toward her. It was slow, methodical, but it was coming for her. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like stone, her breath stuck in her throat. The Hollow Man was real, and it wasn't a creature. It was her. It was the fear that had lived inside her for years, the darkness in her own soul that she had tried to outrun. It was everything she had buried beneath the surface. And now it was coming to claim her, when she finally managed to turn and flee. She could hear the whispers no longer a distant murmur, but clear, sharp, and in her ears. The hollow faces. The hollow faces. You've seen them all. Rachel disappeared that night. They say she was another victim of the legend. They say her face, too, became hollow, just like the others. But no one ever found her body, and her apartment still stands. The lights flickering at night, the windows reflecting the moon's light empty, and somewhere, in the dark corners of East LA, the Hollow Man waits. Jack Miller had always thought of Temecula Valley as a place of redemption, a vineyard, a family legacy. The land had been in his family for generations, and he was determined to bring it back to life. After the death of his grandfather, Frank, the old man's vineyard had been left to Jack, a man with a taste for fine wines and a determination to restore the legacy of a family that had seen its fair share of riches and ruin. But when Jack arrived at the vineyard, something felt off. The old wooden sign that once proudly bore the name Miller's Vineyard was now weathered and crooked, hanging precariously from a single rusty nail. The vines, once thick with plump purple grapes, now seemed sickly and tangled. The soil, too, seemed to resist the touch of a farmer's hand, as though it had grown stubborn over the years. Everything about the place felt ... wrong. Jack stood at the edge of the vineyard, breathing in the dry, dusty air of the valley, staring out at the land his grandfather had worked so hard to cultivate. His grandfather had been a man of great pride, but in the final years of his life, his face had become a mask of regret, his hands shaking as he passed on the secrets of the vineyard to Jack. "I should have never taken it," Frank had said, his voice raspy from years of smoking and drinking. "The land wasn't ours to claim, your grandmother's people. They cursed this land, Jack. They cursed it, and we're paying for it." At the time, Jack thought it was just the ramblings of an old man who had lost touch with reality. But now, standing in the shadow of the dead vines, Jack wasn't so sure. The first night, it began with a silence. The kind of silence that gnaws at your mind, makes you question if you're truly alone. The crickets had stopped chirping, and the wind, usually so constant in the valley, had died down to nothing. Not a leaf rustled. Not a bird called. Just silence. Then the whispers started. They came from the vines. At first, Jack thought he was just hearing things. Long hours of work under the hot sun had a way of playing tricks on his mind. But no matter where he stood in the vineyard, the voices were always there, low and indistinct. They seemed to come from the very earth, like the soil itself was speaking, but Jack couldn't make out the words. The next day, the crops grew. It was an impossibility. The vines, which should have taken weeks to sprout healthy fruit, suddenly blossomed overnight, their grapes swollen and heavy on the vine. At first, Jack thought he had stumbled upon something miraculous, a sudden burst of life after years of neglect. But as he went to pluck the grapes, he felt something cold inside the fruit. It wasn't just the weight of the grapes that made them strange. It was the way they felt beneath his fingers, like skin stretched over bone. That night, Jack's grandfather's words echoed in his mind. The curse, it feeds on greed, on pride, on those who dare to take what isn't theirs. Jack spent the next several days working in the vineyard, trying to ignore the growing unease that twisted inside him. But the vines didn't stop. They kept growing, their twisted, gnarled branches crawling up trellises and over fences, their roots seemingly burrowing deeper into the earth with every passing hour. Then the hallucinations began. It was subtle at first, just fleeting images in the corner of his eye, things he could never quite catch. But as the days dragged on, they became more pronounced. He saw figures moving in the fields at night, their bodies obscured by the vines. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night, his body covered in sweat, only to hear soft footfalls in the dirt outside his window. And the smell, there was always the smell. A heavy, musty odor that reminded him of something rotten, something decayed. Jack finally decided to confront the land head-on. He went out into the vineyard at midnight, determined to face whatever had taken root in the soil. He walked between the rows of vines, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and he could feel the presence of something ancient watching him. It was as though the land itself was alive, breathing beneath his feet, stirring with every step he took. He knelt down by the largest vine, its tendrils twisting unnaturally in the air, and he dug his hands into the dirt. Beneath the surface, he found something strange, something solid. With a grunt, he pulled it free, a small, weathered box half buried in the soil. It was old, too old, its edges frayed and cracked. His heart pounded as he pried it open. Inside was a collection of objects, bone fragments, beads, and curled in the corner of the box a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. He opened the journal and began reading, the words scrawled across the pages in a language he didn't recognize. But as he turned the pages, something familiar began to surface: a name. His grandfather's name, and then, in jagged letters, the words, "Stolen land, stolen souls." the truth began to sink in. The land was cursed, as his grandfather had said. Not by natural forces, but by something far older, far darker. The Native American tribes who had once inhabited the valley had placed a curse on the land after his family had stolen it from them. The land had fed off the greed and bloodshed of the family, growing stronger with each generation that had claimed it. Jack's heart raced as he realized the gravity of what he had done. He hadn't just inherited a vineyard, he had inherited the curse. And now, the grapes themselves were feeding on the sins of his ancestors. With every harvest, the land grew more powerful, more insidious. And there was no way to escape it. The whispers were louder now, growing frantic, like a chant rising from the very earth. The vines swayed as though alive, the grapes ripening faster than he could pick them. Jack tried to run, to tear himself away from the vineyard, but the earth seemed to hold him in place. He fell to his knees, his fingers digging into the soil, and for a moment, he felt it something cold and dark, pressing against his chest, wrapping around his heart. And then, the ground beneath him began to shift. Jack screamed, but no sound came. His body began to wither, the vines curling around his limbs, pulling him down into the earth. The vineyard, once a place of hope and promise, was now his tomb. The curse had claimed him, just as it had claimed every other member of his family who had dared to take from this land. The next morning, the vineyard stood quiet, its rows of vines heavy with fruit. And as the sun rose over Temecula Valley, there was one less soul to be counted among the living. Leah Ashford had always been drawn to the sea. Maybe it was her scientific curiosity, or maybe it was something more, a quiet pull. Deep in her bones, a whisper from the water itself. A marine biologist with an insatiable thirst for knowledge. She was more at home in the ocean than on dry land, her life a careful study of creatures that never asked to be understood. But the Channel Islands. Those islands had always been a mystery, a remote part of California's coastline, wild, untamed, and forgotten by all but a few. The research grant she'd received was straightforward: study the effects of rising ocean temperatures on local marine life. Leah was accustomed to working in isolated places, and the Channel Islands promised solitude. No distractions, no one to interrupt her work. No one but the sea. But when Leah arrived on the island, the air was different. Not heavy, but thick. A strange weight hung in the atmosphere, like something forgotten. Buried beneath the tides for centuries, waiting for the right moment to rise. She shrugged it off as nerves a place this quiet, this remote, was bound to feel strange. Still, the first night on the island was restless. She heard it when the sun dipped below the horizon, when the last golden light faded, leaving the ocean in inky darkness. A sound, soft at first. A humming, low, mournful, and so perfectly in tune with the rhythm of the waves that Leah almost mistook it for the wind. But then it changed. It grew more distinct. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the sea. It was a song, a haunting melody stretching over the water like a thread of silk. Leah froze, standing in the small cabin she'd been assigned, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound was almost ... human. No, not human. Something else. Something other. She turned to the window, her hand reaching for the glass. But there was nothing to see, just the waves crashing against the rocks, dark and endless. The song continued. She heard the faintest whisper in it, too, a voice calling. Her name, Leah. Her breath caught in her throat. She'd been alone since she arrived, aside from the occasional supply run by boat. No one else lived on the island. It was just her, the research, and the oppressive silence of the place. The next morning, Leah shook off the feeling, attributing it to the isolation, to fatigue, to the strange acoustics of the sea at night. She made her way to the marine lab. setting up her equipment, her mind occupied with the task at hand. But no matter what she focused on, something in the back of her mind refused to quiet the voice, the song. The presence that had clung to her in the night. By the third day, the song had returned. This time, it was louder, clearer. Leah stood on the cliff edge, the salt wind biting at her skin, her eyes scanning the horizon. There, on the distant rocks, she saw them. Shadows, figures standing just at the waterline, half drowned by the incoming tide. At first, she thought they were a trick of the light, or maybe her imagination playing cruel tricks. But when she blinked, they were still there. Women, their long hair whipped in the wind, their faces pale and drawn. The song was louder now, a chorus of voices singing in an eerie harmony. The words were incomprehensible, but the call was undeniable calling. Her beckoning her closer. Leah stumbled back, her heart racing. She had to be losing her mind. These were just shadows, figures conjured by the isolation, the exhaustion. But deep down, she knew it wasn't her mind playing tricks on her. Something was wrong. A something ancient. Night, Leah couldn't sleep. The song called to her, its sweet, desperate melody pulling her towards the cliffs, towards the ocean. It felt like a longing, deep, aching need to be near the water, to listen to it, to be consumed by it. She couldn't resist. She found herself walking, her legs moving on their own, the moonlight shimmering across the Black Sea. The shore was quiet, save for the rhythmic crash of the waves, but the sound, the song, was everywhere. It surrounded her, wrapping her. In its haunting embrace, Leah stepped onto the rocks, the sharp edges cutting into her bare feet. The tide licked at her ankles, cold and welcoming. She looked out into the water, and there, emerging from the depths, was the source of the song. A woman's face, pale and smooth, with eyes that glowed like silver coins in the dark. Her hair was long, flowing like seaweed in the current, and her lips moved as though singing, though Leah couldn't hear the words, only the melody that seemed to come from everywhere. The woman's skin shimmered, almost like it was wet, and the more Leah stared, the more her heart thudded in her chest, as though her body was being pulled by some invisible force. "Come closer." The voice was soft but unmistakable. A siren's call. Leah felt herself moving forward, unable to stop herself. Her feet dragged against the rough rocks, pulling her closer to the water, closer to the woman who now smiled. A slow, wicked curve of her lips. But then Leah remembered. She remembered the stories, the old ones whispered by the locals. Legends of the Channel Islands, of the mermaids who once lived there, cursed by the sea for their betrayal. They had been women living on the islands long before anyone had settled there. Their beauty unmatched, their songs irresistible. But they had been betrayed, left to drown in the ocean by the men who had loved them. Now, they sang to call men to their watery graves. Leah's breath caught in her throat. She turned to run, but the woman's voice followed her. The melody wrapping around her body like tendrils of cold seaweed, pulling her back. It was too late. She couldn't escape. The song was in her head now, louder than ever. And the woman in the water had stepped out of the waves, our form now solid and real. Leah stumbled backward, but the water rose to meet her, cold and insistent. The song grew louder, filling her ears, drowning out everything else. The woman's eyes were locked on her, and in that moment, Leah understood the terrible truth. The island wasn't just haunted by the past, it was the past. The curse that had bound the mermaids, the lost souls who had once called the islands home, had never been broken. The pact had never been fulfilled. And now, Leah was the one who would fulfill it. The last thing she heard was the voice calling her name. Just like the first night, Leah,